Okay, video 3. What's the matter with brand messaging? So let's reflect on attention. First video in this series is how to design your mind. We focused on multimedia marketing and getting started with entrepreneurial mindset. The second video is planning your identity design, different ways of branding yourself. And if you're here now, we are going to connect how to design your mind, the entrepreneurial mindset, how to brand yourself, and we're going to connect those to your brand experience, brand messaging, and brand development. So if you're watching this now, this series is different ways of brand identity, brand experience, brand development, and this one is about brand messaging. So let's get started. We are going to, I'm going to start by reading most recently published article on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and on my website, amirafatah.com. And on LinkedIn and Facebook, it's at Advertainment Amira. So the article is, what's the matter with brand messaging? So, what do these three have in common? Well, actually, let's rewind a little bit. Okay. So we talked about brand experience, brand messaging, brand development. So we talked from the structure of your brain to the style of your brand and to the service of your business. Where are you? So our next conversation, the fourth video, is going to be catalyzing the connection between the characters of your life and the characteristics of your next reality. So as an identity designer and a business transformation consultant, I zoom out of my identity and I morph into an observer of the conversation. From the nonverbal communication, you kind of notice the unspoken. And from the verbal communication, you are noting the words, the language, the communication. So if you were to imagine that your eyes are lenses of cameras and that your ears are microphones of experience, and your connection to the senses are really just the comprehensive communication between all of the nonverbal and the verbal communication of that conversation. So imagine that comprehensive communication is the closed captioning that's provided for your video, the closed captioning that's provided for you as an observer of that conversation, from the words that are written to the action verbs that are orienting the behavior of the people in that conversation. So from an identity design perspective to a business transformation perspective, any conversation that you're having, zoom in, zoom out, take your identity out of it, and then assess the conversation as if you are an observer of the speakers, of the listeners, of the type of communication that is in the conversation. So to be an observer of the conversation, you're not attached to anything, but you are merely the process of everything. So we're going to shift to creating an intention for this video. And a statement to create an intention for this duration of the time would be to make up a phrase such as, I want to blank. So design or build or connect myself or my story to something from something. So you're going to vary between something and something. Something that is imaginary is your something. Something is something tangible and materialized into your actual reality. So a more specific example would be something like, I want to design my brand to something, print publications, magazines, books, from something. So from my super self, from my future self, from a past self. You want to orient your intention to have something so tangible materialized into your reality, and from something in your invisible mindset, something in your mindset, something that is unique to you and your identity and your character. So now that we've created an intention and we've shifted the mindset to perceive our next conversation, welcome it. Welcome the next conversation as a series of steps to orient your way of viewing this topic about what is the matter with brand messaging. And you can essentially create an intention for any attention that you want to shift to, through, and from. So in doing so, whether you're watching a movie or you're attending an event or you're about to have a conversation, one way to do so is to orient your attention and then create an intention. So view your attention, create an intention, and then shift your mindset to the series of steps that you would like. So let's create an affirmation for an awareness placement for us to get started in this conversation. I'm going to read it aloud, and I welcome you to repeat this affirmation as I'm verbalizing it into this conversation. I magnify this moment by a duration, by a minute, by a time. I magnify this moment by a self, by an identity, by a lifespan. I magnify this moment by an expansion, by an extension, by an experience. I magnify this moment by infinity as eternity. I hope this affirmation created a space for you to visualize yourselves, plural, to visualize yourselves present in this conversation and really be expansive in your growth. So for the duration of this conversation, utilize the affirmation to be present in this moment through your present self as a present identity. So here's to becoming your super self and materializing the manifestations of your mind. So what is the matter with brand messaging? Let's get started. What do these three have in common? The grand finale of an event, the adrenaline of an adventure that's designed as an emotional high, or the peak of a human's personal experience. It's designing with the end in mind. What essentially creates a surplus of a message? Designing with the end in mind is relevant to building a personal brand, styling the success of your super self, or transforming your business to the new and next. The relevancy of designing with the end in mind is that of creating a movement to a destination. So essentially, whether it's your brand or your business or your being, any consumer experience is the transaction between the business, the being, and the brand. So in today's multimedia world, transactions are measured in attention, retention, engagement, and connection. And they're all terms that are defined uniquely to the designer. So, design with the end in mind. There are subliminal messages even when we remake our ask. The co-creation of the answers and the craft of the question. The review of the methodology of the way it is asked is one, and an identifier to theme. Emphasis on theme being the me, it's the perception of you. 2, a how to our reasoning. And 3, a sign of our center. If you're reading this with me, center is spelled with an S. It is an answer to our pre-designed. It's spelled with an S because it's insinuating that our central focus is a precognitive relation of our concept of a connection. It's what's present to our present. Now, if you're into spirituality and things like that, it is insinuating that our center, our self, is present of our present. So you're precisely in the perfect moment as a perfect person, as a perfect expansion of your present identity. So our questions are essentially the answers that we seek. They're reworded, they're renoted, and they're re-noted. It can only be within our cognition, our consciousness, and our character that the formula of a form of you is crafted with the make of our ask. So make the ask, reveal the next, review your text, and replenish the best. This is to connect us also right back to our affirmation of magnifying the moment, attending to your present self through the variation of yourselves, making the ask, revealing the next, reviewing the text, replenishing the best. So, as an identity, evaluate. As an audience, reflect. As the designer, sculpt the sketches. Think of the audience experience as refining definition. In business transformation, refining definition is to reveal the excess and to maneuver the access. I'm going to repeat that. Think of the audience experience as refining definition. In business transformation, refining definition is to reveal the excess and to maneuver the access. Through the revelations and maneuver, there is a platform for the business, the being, and the brand to connect, engage, and attend to and retain with your identity messaging. So in our identity existence, we migrate from a race to space to travel to a space, whether it's outer space, inner space, and essentially existential space. So this is a reminder that our days are for discovery, our days are for recovery, and our days are for the my story of our own mystery. So a couple questions to shift our mindset to an orientation of what's the matter with brand messaging. What is the order of cognitive design, if not by the association and dissociation of the relevancy and the relevancy? What is the design of our mind and our brain? And the complexity of our consciousness, define the programming of our default settings. And as the ratio of our settings, what labels identify the activation of identity? These questions are to orient that observer of you. The observer of you that's perceiving this conversation from what's spoken, what's perceived, and what's not spoken. So, brilliant brain break. Are there layers, levels, or access points to memory suppression? When it comes to disposition, repetition, competition, create a figure of the process of our memory. What about our embedding? What about our coding? What is the process of a self-activation through sensory information? The conceptualization of our existential body. What nodes of our systems communicate to our systemic operations? Consider the body as an accessory of your being. Reflect upon the unspoken communications to our involuntary mechanics. Evaluate what senses are affected. What about the senses that are influenced? What about the ones that are additives? That's your brilliant brain break. Let's pause and reflect. All right. Let's revert back to our awareness placement. The affirmation that when we got started about magnifying this moment and connecting through yourselves to this present moment, to this present identity of you, to the present mindset that you're in or from. Reflect on yourselves in this moment. Which questions that were just asked were valid to a past, present, or future self of you? Where is your present self in this particular moment? Can you orient your mindset to communicate through a self of you? What about the self of you that would like to connect from the past to the future? Which self of you is giving in? Which self of you is giving up? Which self of you is giving back? Now let's shift our perception to our defined definitions of what giving in is. What about giving up? And what about giving back? Maybe giving in is the cycles of our recycle. Maybe giving up is the upcycle of our in cycle. And maybe giving back is the bicycle of our tricycle. So a sweet tip to continue this conversation with all versions of yourselves, asking the questions from your past self to your future self, or your future self to your past self, whatever direction yourselves are in this moment. Zoom out, magnify this moment, become the observer. Let's create your thoughts as visual images. Imagine handwriting the messaging to your present selfie. Let's say you just start sketching something right now. If you were to grab a pen and paper and just start sketching something, start drawing something, you're really just creating your thoughts as visual images. There you are. You're a designer. Now evaluate the drawing. Re-narrate the way that it would be described if it was displayed as a museum gallery. You're at a museum and you just see that sketch you just drew on the wall, and there's a little script right beside it. Evaluate that messaging. Re-narrate the way it would be if you were to describe it in words right next to that picture. Now pause and zoom out. Upon reflection of the selfie, evaluate the self of you and the self of the drawer. So now that you, that just imagine that situation between you actually drawing something on a piece of paper and you at a museum reading that script that's right beside that image, zoom out. Now you just created multiple versions of yourself. Zoom out even more. You are now the observer of those versions of yourself. Evaluate the self of you, the self of the drawer, and the extra IE of that self, that selfie, is in other words. When you see IE in other words, what other ways could you describe the drawing? How else would you define the terminology that you used? If you could use other words, what would they be? If you could modify the drawing, what would you do? Why do you refer to the thoughts that you originally designed as images in this style? Why do you think the way that you think? What about that version of you, that self, is thinking in that way? Now pause and zoom in. Utilize these shapes as mental memos of your story script for a selected self of you. So that image you just drew on that paper, that sketch you just imagined, or if you actually sketched something out, when you zoomed out, now you're zooming back in. What are these shapes that you just drew? Could you use them as references for mental memos? Could you think about this conversation that you just had with these versions of yourself as scripts for that version of you that just drew that? Now zoom through all of that. How many varied versions of you did you just experience? How did this conversation just narrate an entire storyboard for you to create one image and design yourself as a designer. How can brand messaging materialize your imagination to become your next manifestation? I'm going to revert back to this affirmation that we started with and let that be a way to translate this conversation into our next conversation, where we're going to talk about delegating the designs of your brand via experience, messaging, and development. I magnify this moment by a duration, by a minute, by a time. I magnify this moment by a self, by an identity, by a lifespan. I magnify this moment by an expansion, by an extension, by an experience. I magnify this moment by infinity as eternity. I am Advertainment Amira, and I hope this conversation allowed you to create that space for you to question, what is the matter with brand messaging, to evaluate yours and design your next reality. Stay connected, stay sweet. Thanks for being here.